Hello. The following is all personal opinion. There are a lot of aspects of Buddhism that are hard to understand. The advice to move away from one's ego, the idea that the emotions of desire and aversion are the cause of all human suffering. None of that really makes sense, given that we've evolved to operate through an ego, which seems to work very well. We've got the emotions of desire and aversion for a reason. Why would a religion ask us to go against the way that nature's made us? Well, in short, it's because our tendency towards desire and aversion exists in a modern form that's actually not natural. The way we used to perceive reality, the way we would do certain things and avoid certain other things, was very different before we reprogrammed our minds with things like language and other technologies. Buddhism is an early science conducted through experience rather than theoretical calculation that reduces human suffering, and it's nothing more than that. There are many different schools of Buddhism that have different ideas about reality, but the original point of Buddhism was just the science of human suffering, and as it turns out, to get rid of suffering, one has to also understand the nature of the universe. Why? Because human suffering is caused by the pain of being ignorant to the nature of reality. It's caused by us losing our felt sense of what actually exists. So if you hear anyone talking about Buddhist teachings in a moralistic way, like, oh, you just should be mindful, you just should do that because it's the right way of seeing things, that's not quite right. We've lost our felt sense of what exists due to our biology and things that have happened to us. Buddhism prescribes ways of getting back to it that aren't intellectual, they're experiential. They reprogram your mind over time. And now modern science shows, looking at brain scans, that people who, for example, meditate do restructure their brain over time. So people find when they engage in mindfulness meditation, which is very much tuning into reality, it's trying to apply your attention to your surroundings quite aggressively. People find when they do that, they improve their sense of well-being. So there's that connection between knowing what exists and feeling better. And I think what's happening is, if you apply your brain to the physical world, you're not giving it as much of its processing power over to rumination. But much of the way we think every moment of the day is sort of caught up in abstract thoughts about things that aren't immediately palpable. So things that are in the past, things that you project into the future. And this really robs our ability to plug into physical reality. We have to think this way, that's the way we operate. But I'm suggesting that we didn't always have to think quite the same. And the result is that it's a bit uncomfortable. Language, which makes up a lot of this abstract thought, is man-made. We have a language center in the brain, so there are linguistic areas of the brain, but these evolve to cover instinctive language, laughter, crying, screaming, the signals we give to others that don't ever need to be taught, and possibly singing. We've got this 3-octave vocal range, we understand harmony. Darwin thought we sung before we spoke. But words, we have to teach each generation anew. So this is a man-made technology, as you know. And in learning to think and see the world through this veil of symbolism, we are in effect running a software program on the hardware that is our natural brain, and that muddies the ability of the brain to do what it evolved to do, which was not speak in words, but simply plug perfectly into reality, exactly. So to exactly fit its perception of the environment with what the environment was actually like. So if you do something that's slightly different with the brain, it impairs its capacity to do what it did in its original state. When I say language, I don't just mean the words that we speak. I'm talking about the process of thinking symbolically. So you look at an item in the environment and you consciously say to yourself, that's a tree. I remember encountering this before and it's like that. And, I was taught it's this kind of tree. And you make a map and you hang it on a mental hook. And your map of reality is based on your very limited experience of what exists out there. And it's up to you to store all that information consciously in a format made of language and symbols somewhere in the brain. And this way of mapping the world is totally artificial. None of the other animals have to do it like that. They can feel into their environment as though it's an extension of them, because they live in an Edenic state. They live in a state of symbiosis with nature. They don't also have a technological component to their lifestyle, so there's nothing unfamiliar to their DNA, and they're not operating an artificial way of thinking. So all the problem solving of how they should interact with the world beyond them has been taken care of by the process of evolution. It's all built into their bodies, how they need to interact with the world. They don't need to think, they're just doing stuff on instinct. Evolution is trial and error made flesh. It's a problem-solving technology. It presents ideas to the environment, and the environment says, yes, that works, or no, it doesn't. So animals' physical form, their natural behavior, their instinctive perception of what each thing in their environment means to them is literally written into their ancestors' DNA and their DNA by extension. And it's written by the environment. So, the ones that got the wrong code in their DNA and had the wrong behavior died out. So what you've got, if you're an animal, is a very accurate picture of what the environment is like, because the behavior of the items in the environment has been written into your DNA over millions of years. Now, granted, you only know the nature of those things in terms of which aspects of these things are relevant to you. So you still don't fully know the nature of things on their own terms, but you do know how they've behaved over millions of years instinctively. So in many ways, you're very much plugged into the matrix of being. You're plugged into a matrix of knowledge referred forward over a long period of time. This is a key component of human ignorance. When we approach the world through problem solving, we're incapable of seeing things on their own terms, but also of seeing even the relevant edges of things very clearly, because these haven't been programmed into our DNA over a long period of time. We evolved in the rainforest, so anything outside the rainforest is unlikely to be written into us. And what we're doing is guessing through our limited experience of what these things are like. The other problem is a lot of our world now is artificial. So the instincts can't inform us about artificial stuff. Our DNA can't be updated in real time, about what this new behavior in society means to us and how we should navigate it. So we're forced to stick with our way of mapping our physical surroundings through looking at it, hanging it on a hook of meaning, and just hoping that our version of the territory is accurate enough to help us get by. This way of thinking started when we moved from the rainforest to the savanna. Our instincts evolved in the rainforest, and we could live in accordance with what felt good and bad. On the savanna, though, these instincts were suddenly out of date. They didn't correspond to what that environment was like. So in the trees, it felt good to chill out, eat mangoes, have sex. On the savanna, you suddenly had to be engaged in a way of life that was constant work. You had to make fire and tools and weapons. It was your responsibility to stay alive. The environment wasn't doing that for you anymore, so you had to negotiate with it. And we can see that our move to the savanna was quick because the body didn't have time to adapt physical traits that would allow us to remain as the other animals do in this Edenic state. We didn't evolve claws and teeth to fight predators and catch prey. We didn't evolve night vision or speed. So it was up to us to bridge the gap between what the environment required of us physically and what we were capable of physically, and there's a huge gap between those two, by making tools. We can't get away from predators on foot, but we can create fire to scare them off. We can't digest raw meat because it's got pathogens in it. It's dangerous if we eat it raw, but we can cook it and make it edible, and so on. The need for language came from a similar gap between what our environment required us to instinctively perceive about it and what we could instinctively perceive about it. And there's a huge gap there. In the trees, we could just know what was dangerous by feeling it in our DNA, and know what was pleasurable and good by feeling that. If you see a spider in the trees, that shape, 8 legs, means jump back. Whereas if you see something with 20 legs, it's not very frightening. This has been written into us because the people who didn't fear the 8-legged thing probably died out much more. On the savanna, though, there's loads of things your instincts can't read. You should jump back from a poisonous plant, but your body doesn't recognize it as dangerous. And if instinct was the way that we previously read our environment, and I'm suggesting it really was, it was a very different way of interacting. It was a seamless way of interacting with the world beyond yourself. The world felt like an extension of you. If that's how we read our environment primarily when we were in the rainforest, then we went to a place where objects are not corresponding to our primary sensory perception of them. It would be like modern man moving to a place now where there are objects that we're banging into, but they don't correspond to our eyes, because we do a lot of the decoding visually now. And it would be like having all these invisible things we can't see, but they are affecting us. So what would we do in that situation? I think we may cast veils of material across these objects so that we could adumbrate those edges of the objects that were relevant to us to stop us from banging into them. This would tell us nothing of the objects themselves. We may learn that over many years or over many generations, but we could just pick out the edges that we think we need to know about. And that's exactly what we did with words. We could apply concepts and corresponding novel mouth noises or words to different objects that were novel to our sensory perception, and then hold a man-made map that we hoped was accurate of what the environment looked like in our heads. And we could use these words to communicate our maps amongst ourselves and collaboratively catalogue all the items of environmental novelty that we needed to know about to survive. This was also key in thinking strategically, in manually accessing the past and manually projecting into the future. And I say manually because we're operating the brain in a very conscious, willed way. Animals have a capacity to do that, but they don't do it habitually to the extent we did. I mean, you see animals making tools when there's environmental failure. You know, a crow can make it kind of makeshift tool, and chimps, of course, can. But they don't operate that way because actually the key problem solving of staying alive in an optimal state has been done by the effect of the environment on their body. They exactly fit it. Why would they need to improve upon perfection? The start of our perception of everything being separate instead of all part of the same system started at this moment where the environment could no longer be treated as a contiguous extension of ourselves, something we could know through our feelings, something that was written into our biology, but instead the environment was now something that had to be negotiated with as though a stranger, something with an unknown personality that had to be decoded and then appeased. And this estrangement, the sudden not knowingness we were plunged into, when for all of our history up until then, there was no unfamiliarity to our experience. You know, the world was like a familiar family environment. You know, we were the mirror image of it. Most, if not all, of the things we ever encountered were recognizable to our biology. So this estrangement caused a profound hunger to return to that state of grace and understanding that much later the Buddhists would say we've actually found a way of getting back to. We've found a way of lifting the veil, and the veil is the conceptual content in that film of meaning through which we have to strive for the external world. Now, we do have to kind of put up a meniscus between us and reality, because we have to label everything as an almost instinctive way of being, but it's false, really. It feels like we decode the environment very easily without conscious thought, but it's a mechanism that we've kind of made ourselves so that we can keep ourselves slightly separate from what's going on and not feel the wrong feelings about things that we see, but rather know intellectually that could be deceptive, that could be something else. Now, the brain didn't evolve to deal with this level of innovation. If you stop operating on instinct and work in a problem-solving way very quickly, it's an act of neurological cannibalization. We are an autovorous species. We're eating our own bodily resources to stay alive. Because if you're forced into this way of being suddenly, you don't have time to evolve a section of brain that deals with making tools as a way of life. Like I say, animals can make tools, but what I'm talking about is seeing reality through the tool of symbolic mapping, for example. This is very ingrained into how we have to live, and we didn't have time to evolve sections of brain that would just be dedicated to doing this. If you look at animals who are technologists, who make nests, for example, they do have a section of brain given over to making a nest, so they don't need to be taught, they know it instinctively. Well, we don't have that, so we've got to take a piece of brain that evolved for something else and repurpose it. And therefore, as we repurpose it to make tools, we lose its original function. And in this way, we're risking perceptual holes appearing where the sections of brain that evolved to do something else can't do that thing anymore. So we know this from mindfulness, that we're losing our grip on reality in a way, because when you tune back into it, something as prosaic as the physical world, the ground beneath you, you suddenly feel better. It's because the degree of rumination is not quite right. It's not sort of conducive to comfort in any case. So what is the hidden nature of reality that we're no longer perceiving? And here we get into what almost sounds like a telepathic aspect of enlightenment. The idea in nirvana as well, that you're connected to all things and it's all euphoric and you feel like you have a felt intelligence of what exists around you. Some people who take psychedelics report that they feel a wave of compassion going outwards and a wave of feedback from the environment coming inwards in the form of grief and, love and all sorts of things. That's what I'd call the functioning nervous system, albeit one that extends beyond one's own body. But morality operates like that. We've got mirror neurons in our head so that we view another human as though they're ourselves. If we hurt somebody else, we feel that pain almost like it's in our own body, and there's a section of brain for that. But the section of brain that perhaps once extended out to the environment, that seems to have dwindled somewhat, but that intelligence would be damn handy, because if you thought that the environment is as it is, alive, and you felt it as an extension of yourself, you'd feel averse to degrading it in the way we do, and that's simply intelligence, because if you do degrade it, it'll come back to bite you in the ass. So how did this intelligence get coded into our DNA? And, since then it seems to have been lost somewhat. And something that needs to be activated through meditation and so on. But how did it get coded in? Now, before I say anything here, I just want to reiterate, this is not esoteric. This is mundane and mechanical. There's a holographic nature to the universe. Every fragment of the system has the signature of everything else within that system imprinted on it somehow, because all the things that happened to it made it the fragment it is. It's been subject to the oceanic forces of everything else that exists, seeing as everything's connected. So even the distant corners of that system had an impact on the fragment. If a rock is subject to a force that splits it into two pieces, you can look at one piece and make inferences about the piece you don't have. The other half has written its signature onto the piece you do have, and even our level of science can unravel some of the threads of incident that cause the fragment you have to behave and look the way it does. Now, the ontological signature resident in everything material is far more advanced than our science could unscramble, but it's there nonetheless, and this is reflected in physics and also more reflected probably in philosophy. The universe is resident within a grain of sand and all that. And in a way, it's very clear in terms of the material universe. That's just how it works. Everything is subject to the laws of physics. If you have one thing occupying a space, another physical thing can't occupy the same space. And in that way, everything fits together as though it's a giant puzzle, and all the pieces may be fragmenting into a more complex puzzle, but things still perfectly fit together because they're behaving at the behest of local physics. When biology comes along, we see something that looks like the introduction of another factor into the equation, which is agency. Biology seems to want to do things that will change this paradigm of everything simply being influenced by physics. So, of course, biology has to adhere to the laws of physics too, but it does more than physics. It does other things with the addition of agency. If you look at planet Earth, it should be losing mass as it travels through space. If it had no biome, no ozone layer, the friction of traveling would cause it to lose some mass. But with biology, that is acting as a net that traps leaking light energy and solidifies it with carbon dioxide and water and makes it solid, and then eventually stores it in the topsoil as carbohydrate through plant matter and animal matter in turn. And it's almost like every piece of biology is living in service to this endeavor of fossilizing sun, as a biologist told me, that because I thought I'd made all this up, but he said no, they learned at university that's what all biological life is. It's trying to fossilize sun. So whether it's mitigating mass loss or not, the point is biology is in effect dynamic matter, and it's dynamic matter that responds to environmental laws in ways that alter the consequence of physics alone on a supposedly dead universe. It alters the consequence on physics that would normally confine cause and effect to narrower, if not definite, outcomes. What's interesting about biology is the way it operates is through negotiation with the material environment. It's like intelligence that puts forward a proposition and it waits to hear the answer from the universe as to whether that proposition fits into the puzzle piece of the material universe. It asks if it can do something, and anything that biology proposes that doesn't fit into the puzzle piece of the bigger picture simply dies out. The environment says no to it. This may well be an unconscious and Darwinian process, as far as we know. I'm not saying life knows it's doing this, but it's the process that works and therefore allows biology to endure. The ability to read the information in DNA, for example, and respond in accordance with the DNA's suggestions of what feels good and what feels bad is our consciousness. We are readers and responders. The thing to remember is that if you influence one thing in your environment, you are affecting the status of the universe as a whole. So there's no small action within the universe. Everything is connected to everything else, which is possibly why a very extended nervous system, a very good sense of what was going on far beyond your own body would actually be useful, so that you could feel your actions in a way that would reflect the potential butterfly effect of your actions on far corners of the world, if not beyond the world and into the rest of the universe. And this is why when you are in a natural condition, when your brain is working as it should, when the edges of your puzzle piece are flush with the edges of the hole that houses your puzzle piece, I think you can actually look down what feels like the corridors of infinity and apprehend things that seem quite remote. So the headline for biology is that it has to be dynamic if it's going to survive the changing picture of reality. You can't have the same model of animal surviving forever, because the environment that houses it will place different demands on it, and it has to update its picture of what reality looks like. And it does this by asking questions through mutations in our DNA. And each mutation is in effect a question about the changing environment's status. It's asking, do you look like this? Do you look more like this? If the proposition it puts forward does make it more in sync with the environment than the other animals, that confers an adaptive advantage and informs the next change in that species of animal over time. This works on the level of consciousness too. If I have a truly accurate felt sense of what reality is like, then I'll behave in accordance with the way things are. And again, this would mean not trespassing upon certain parts of the environment that would come back to harm us in the long term. How might we register the nature of reality if we did perceive what was going on? I think it would be the way people describe enlightenment. We would feel connected to everything, and it would register to us as though it was made out of love, because you always feel the things that you treasure as though they're made out of love. So this euphoric connection to everything would, again, be damn handy. It would stop us from doing the things that we don't feel an aversion to doing, but we know will kill us in the long term. Now, here I want to clarify why religions conflate the two concepts of morality all the time and enlightenment, morality and intelligence. It's because they are the same thing. Morality is intelligence of what's happening outside your own experience. Ignorance and sin are conflated in religion because they are the same thing. If you don't know what's happening outside your intelligence, you're an unwitting sinner because you cause harm where you didn't mean to. You just couldn't realize what you were doing. And a natural, innate sense of morality that was not made out of intellectual concepts the way we have to make our morality now. An instinctive morality that informed you about the nature of things could once have existed. If you think of reality as a glass sheet and it's been shattered into loads and loads of puzzle pieces that make it up, then so long as your edges exactly concur with those of the whole that you're in, you'll be able to feel into that space that's beyond you, because it's the nodes of connection, as they say in Hinduism, or the places where things connect in Buddhism, that contains your perception of everything that exists. I think that's what they're getting at, that if something vibrates the corner of the glass sheet and you're exactly fitting into the puzzle piece, the vibrations will be very accurately transmitted through your edge to you, so that you feel like you are the glass sheet itself. The vibrations that are sent to you will affect your body as though you're exactly fitting the entire universe, but you are still that fragment. It's just a case of exactly fitting the hole that you're supposed to be in. Now, we have moved away from our original puzzle piece, fitting exactly into the puzzle. The edges that would allow information to be transmitted to us about the environment in a way that corresponds with our DNA, they're not in the right place, because we have unplugged parts of our brain from what they were originally doing in order to deal with the amount of artifice that we require to stay alive in an unfamiliar territory. So we've lost touch with how to perceive, and the mechanism that wrote the intelligence of what existed into our bodies purely by natural selection. The ones that didn't have the right picture of the universe were died out because they couldn't see down the corridors of consequence, but they were killed by consequence long term. So you end up having an accurate picture of what exists written into your DNA, you could say by chance almost. Humans currently don't. Religion, as I was saying in my last video, is very similar to tools and language. Tools, remember, bridge the gap between what the environment demands of us physically and what our bodies are capable of physically. Language bridges the gap between the knowledge and understanding the environment demands of us and what our brains understand and know instinctively. Again, there's a huge gap because our brains got their instincts from the rainforest, so they don't know anything much about the savannah. And religion bridges the gap between how the environment needs us to behave if we're going to survive and how we feel like behaving, because again, we evolved feelings in another environment. So there's a big gap between our tendencies to hang around like eating biscuits and having sex, because originally we just, ate mangoes and procreated, and we were up high away from predators. We were playful and, we chilled out a lot. You can't do that post-savannah. You've got to go away from what you feel like doing. And we have constructed morality as an intellectual bridge to bridge what you should feel like doing and what you do feel like doing, because the body hasn't had time to have this written into its DNA. So that's another bloody thing. We've got a hold in our head. The head has already been taken up with a lot of artifice that stops it from plugging into reality. Morality is yet another thing. I mean, for God's sake, when's all the apprehension of what exists going to happen? No wonder we can't tell what's going on. From our limited perspective, we think that morality is charity. It doesn't benefit us. But we do feel good about giving, and there's a remnant of our picture of the system beyond us. When you feel good about something, it tells you that's the nature of how your species needs to operate. And those actions should be followed, not for the dopamine hit, but because the dopamine hit is a reflection of what is. Now, the problem, of course, that I was looking at in the last video is that technology interrupts the conversation between person and environment. The body can't evolve in sync with an environment that's artificial, partly because it's changing way too quickly. None of this has time to be written into your DNA over many generations that are necessary to give you a true impression of what that piece of technology means. We may get superficial aspects of technology written into us, but they'll only be a short-term impression of how this tool behaves. We won't see the long-term consequences of it. So feeling into the environment that is constantly being reshaped and reshaped again means your instincts fall woefully short. You can't perceive the nature of things. In a way, therefore, what choice do we have? we have to create these workarounds. They may be expensive in terms of brain power. They may be causing more of the problem that they're actually designed to mitigate against, but we can't survive without them. We need our tools and language and religion. So what do we do? And religion takes different approaches to this. Buddhism says, become the enlightened figure. You can become Buddha. We've got a handbook for doing this. It just takes a hell of a long time, and you've got to kind of get away from all the artifice that actually is required to survive. I think it's quite cruel in a way, because it's like, you just should be mindful, idiot. When the reality is we're biologically disabled. We can't be mindful. If you follow what Buddhism actually prescribes, it says do these exercises and they deprogram the stuff that's clouding your perception. They don't blame you for being an idiot. We are the victim of circumstance to an extent. It's trying to work out what to do that's the kind of quest we need to go on, I think. And there's not a clear answer, because Buddhism says become the enlightened person. Christianity and all the religions that mirror Christianity, there were several before it that had the same story of a protagonist, the enlightened man called Horus or Jesus or Jesus, that was sacrificed and then resurrected in a more distant form as a sky god or something, but it's not here anymore. And it's the story of us sort of accepting enlightenment and society. I can't do everything. I've got to make a living. And the two are completely at odds with each other. So I'm going to choose to sacrifice enlightenment and just bloody move forward in a state of sin. Well, that's what happened to us. Like, we're moving forward in a state of sin and ignorance. And Christianity says, look, this is what we did, but you've got to keep the phone line going to the enlightened being. That's the best chance you have of surviving. Follow these absolute rules that pertain to morality, that pertain to what reality's like, even if you don't feel like following them, and you should be okay. So really, we got to remember the cost of the sacrifice, that we are ignorant, and ignorance is sin. That's the price of technology. We had to engage in technology. We were forced out of the rainforest. There was no other way, but this is the price. One of the key recommendations Buddhism offers is to meditate, and that is a very clear tool that attempts to undo the repurposing that language in particular does, this way of symbolically mapping the environment. So if you use a mantra, for example, you are jamming the linguistic activity in your head. You're repeating a phrase over and over, which occupies the linguistic areas, but because you're repeating it, it gets shorn of all conceptual content. So you're occupying the areas with nothing. It's very clever. And as you do that, and language is deactivated, meditators will tell you that something else wells up in its stead, some other kind of awareness that's much more natural, that seems more in tune with reality, starts to rise up. And that can happen over minutes for some people who just like bloody good at meditating or something, over months or years. For me, it took months to get any glimpses of this altered state. And what it looks like when you remove concepts is, it's like you remove the veil, that's meniscus of conceptual calculation we have to have that separates us from reality. And when that veil is gone, it is like a veil that goes, and everything that only words represent, that can't actually be reached, the past and the future, for example, which I do think of them as real. But when words disappear, you realize, no, they were just things that I symbolized with words to make a model of what reality is like, but it's not like that, seemingly, because the past and future simply vanish. And it's like a latching point where all your consciousness that used to be diluted across these three times, the past, present, and future, is suddenly all applied to the reality of the present moment. And because there's so much more of it applied to reality now, you increase your apprehension of what exists, the veil of language gets lifted, and there is a shocking sense of what is. It's very different to what you thought it was. And I mean, as far as I know, this is the first rung on the ladder of improving your consciousness, and that's the only rung I've ever got to. But I think Eckhart Tolle describes this as the itness of things. It's a realization that things have aspects to them that your perception does not inform you about. and it almost registers as though everything is sentient. It's like you're waking up from a dream where you thought everything that existed was made up by you, and now you're realizing it isn't. And that might seem strange because we know it isn't. But what you're waking up to is everything as I perceived it was my construction. It actually isn't like that at all. And the area where its apparent agency, its apparent otherworldly personality and mind meets is utterly frictionless. There's absolutely no connection between the two, and yet we're the same thing. So when language is lifted off and you have no conative, if that's a word, projections onto anything, holy shit, it's an extraordinary revelation that our way of seeing is artificial. So before having these small glimpses of the altered states that seem more real than normal reality does, I just didn't believe in enlightenment at all. I thought it was made up because if I know people, they'll say anything to get attention. But once I realized the Buddhists definitely know what they're doing, I've started to believe in it. Like I say, I'm not pursuing it for some reason. I should be, but I'm not. Before we get into what Buddhism prescribes to get back to the state of enlightenment, there's another major factor. This is probably more influential than what I've been talking about in our sort of degradation of our ability to perceive reality. So far, we've discussed behavioral traits, ways of seeing the world that repurposes the brain, cannibalizes neurological resources so that they can't do what they originally evolved to do, and clouds your lens of perception. So that's one factor in us having to work our way consciously back to the brain operating so that it can see things as they are. Another major issue is that the brain has been shrinking for thousands of years. This is reflected in the fossil record. Tony Wright has an explanation of what this shrinkage is about. I mean, science currently says the brain's just getting more efficient, which contradicts the scientific view that when our brains expanded, we got more intelligent. Oh, when it's shrinking, it doesn't have a correlation with intelligence. So if the brain is in a process of deactivating certain sections and then eventually losing them physically, what's the reason for this? Well, Tony Wright says the brain was originally built on our high-fruit diet in the rainforest. It's reflected in our anatomy. Sweetness is the main thing we taste. We're strongly drawn to that. The brain and muscles run on glucose. And if we ate more fruit by weight than any other species, which we seem to have, chimps eat a high fruit diet and they are more intelligent than gorillas who eat a high greens diet. It's reflected across different species in fruit bats and vampire bats as well. It seems to be connected to having a bigger brain, eating a high fruit diet, and we seem to eat the highest fruit diet around. Fruit is the womb of a plant, and it's sort of like a mammal's uterus, and that is a very juvenile environment that has a bunch of chemicals that are designed to trigger hormonal switches and affect the way that DNA is read. So if we were flooding our bloodstream with sex chemicals of another species, albeit a plant species, that had the capacity to affect the way our DNA was being realized, in the same way that when you take sex change hormones, your DNA is still the same, but it's triggering hormonal switches to make you change sex. So with fruit, the effect seemed to be that we were a younger version, we were juvenilized, so there was a longer time before puberty. That allowed the brain to proliferate mass for longer. So we see in the fossil record the brain exploding in size, tripling of its volume, and the appearance of the modern neocortex, which is the executive layer through which we see reality. So since we moved to the savannah, we can't eat that high fruit diet. It's not available in the same quantities all year round as it was in the rainforest. So we can't maintain the brain's operations and functions. Also, a lot of our diet is cooked on the savannah. There's confusion because we seem to be getting better and better and more smart as we go along. We're getting better at fighting the environment. We're getting smarter at technology, language, conceptual ways of thinking. We are getting better in some ways. We're getting less and less good at being connected to what exists, though. And that's clear from our bizarre behavior. We're also adapting to the artificial world instead of the world beyond that. So you can currently see an adaptation. It's an advantage to be a psychopath. It's an advantage to be a narcissist. That relates very well to the environmental demands that we've placed upon ourselves with our man-made cocoon. But from afar, we're not improving. This is not progress. We're less connected to the thing we need to be connected to. And the brain, with fewer nutritional resources once it was on the savannah, had to steward those to the areas that were absolutely crucial to keeping us alive in the short term. That's what you'd go for, isn't it? What keeps me alive for the next day? And what keeps you alive is fear and control. The stuff that's connected to, the environment that feels into other people's experience, that has self-awareness and artistry. Those things are being sacrificed. Those things are what seem to be activated when one takes plant medicines or engages in spiritual practices over a long period of time. So that, in combination with our brain's bombardment of artifice, is clouding our lens, our ability to connect with reality. How does this go with what Buddhism suggests? There are 4 noble truths in Buddhism. The first is that life contains suffering. This is the layer of conceptual suffering. This is the content of the meniscus that we've had to create. I like that word. Life contains suffering. The second is that the mind's tendency towards desire and aversion is the cause of this suffering. So in the West, we might treat a sickness with a pharmaceutical. And in the same way with suffering, we might find the immediate cause of our suffering and try to treat that situation. Buddhism would rather say, eat a natural diet and you'll never have any sicknesses. This is a one-for-all technique. And similarly, it says, get rid of the mind's desire and aversion and you'll never have any suffering no matter what comes up. Because the third noble truth is, if you get rid of the desire and aversion, the suffering goes away. The fourth noble truth is, we have a way of getting rid of the desire and aversion. The desire and aversion, in my opinion, refers to the symbolic mapping of what we believe we should desire to keep ourselves alive and what we believe we should get away from to keep ourselves alive. Pain and suffering are different because pain is a signaler within nature that this stuff can't get rid of. Pain is instructive, but it only hurts you as much as it needs to get you to behave in the right way. Suffering, the problem of suffering, is that our emotions are man-made. They don't feel man-made because they happen in the stomach. But there are attempts to map in real time what action needs to be taken in relation to things in our environment that have not been written into our DNA. And so they currently just make us suffer way too much. They're a bad map of reality. The conceptual layer that we cast over everything imposes what I'm talking about, an unutterably terrible onus on us to take responsibility for our own survival. No other animal does this. Like, all the problem solving that the other animals need to go through to survive has been done by evolution. It's resident in their physiology and the way they want to behave. But with us, we're having to work out what the environment requires of us to stay alive. It's a lot of calculation. We're having to feel responsible for other people we love staying alive. So the radical acceptance of what happens that Buddhism rather cruelly prescribes you should get back to, well, we can't really do that, can we? Because we have to second guess what's going to happen all the time. And, you could only do that if you went and lived back in the rainforest. I think the state of enlightenment you get to, it requires you to pare down your life an awful lot. But it's probably not that pristine condition that we were once in. It's just so much better than the way we normally apprehend things, that we think it's total enlightenment. And the radical acceptance is the acceptance that every animal has. They'll avoid pain when they need to, they'll feel scared when they need to. However, it's not their job to work out how to stay alive. And their relationships with each other is much simpler. It's not their job to keep other people alive necessarily, apart from the relationship to one's children. But even that, you can see, is far less desperate than our relationship with our children is. So everything for animals has been taken care of. No guilt, no preemptive fear. Preemptive fear is a waste of time. If you need to feel fear, you feel it in the right moment. They have radical acceptance. They see loved ones perish, They know there's a hole in their life that's the shape of that loved one that the pain will inform them about. They'll find a way to act that the pain directs them to. But it's never in their heads to intervene with circumstance quite to the degree it is in a human's head. We feel it's our responsibility to actually influence what happens. And to some extent it is, but our impression of how much is totally confused. So when somebody dies, we go through a stage of bargaining with reality in case that might work. We go through a stage of denying reality what it told us, like maybe it didn't happen. And in modern life, post-conceptual thinking, the brain just knows it's our job to make everything go right. But how we make everything go right hasn't been written into our DNA accurately, partly because it hasn't had time to, partly because the way to make things work changes every 10 years. So it'll never get written in accurately. Nature has not taken care of us in that respect because we have insulated ourselves from nature. We've had to. Nature tried to kill us, so we've gone against that and we're doing our best here, but everything is our fault now. Everything. And the emotions we feel in relationships are approximations of roughly what the body thinks is going on. And in these situations, the emotions are completely and utterly wayward and make us act like we're mad. Mad meaning that we're not seeing reality as it is. We're trying to fumble for an approximation of how we should behave, and very often there's an amorphous emotion that comes up that just says, advocate for yourself, idiot. The emotions that have had more time to crystallize are very specific. The emotions we feel day to day, though, are amorphous. They don't pertain to the situation because the situation's false. Like, no, we just basically have to err on the side of caution with everything. But that's the thing that seems to be working in the short term to keep us alive. Worrying about everything too much, second guessing everything, and it's suffering. It's a cause of bloody suffering. Buddhism helps you to get rid of this conceptual operating system that is not correctly mapping what exists. However, it is a game plan for how to operate artificial reality well. So what do you want, Buddhism? I mean, I can't do both. But Buddhism says, try to get down to the writing in your DNA, It tries to get rid of the layer that you place between you and circumstance that makes you believe you could have intervened in circumstance to be treated better, and gives you a terrible sense of guilt and it shouldn't be like this because I could have changed it. Instead, it gets you closer to the radical acceptance. It wasn't your problem, so she left you. Don't believe what Steven Spielberg says. The part of your mind that thinks you could have prevented that says, well, you're going to die now. And she's gone, so you're worthless. You're as naught. Without the conceptual layer that second guesses everything, you just notice an absence. You'd be vaguely aware that somebody's missing. It would be far less of a feeling of desperate attachment to everything. The state of non-attachment, that again I think is unfairly advocated in Buddhism, as though it's a choice, which it isn't in modernity, doesn't make you an emotionless automaton, it just makes you in touch with reality. Part of the reason meditation makes the negative emotions less intense and makes you a less reactive person, as far as I can tell, is because your brain becomes better at seeing what exists. All of this thing that I've been saying in this video is a result of meditation. It's not the result of intellectual wrestling with anything. It's like, oh, that's how it is. So I think meditation, I mean, you might not believe this story, but if you do, I think meditation just makes things more obvious because you're taking your consciousness out of the past and future. More of it's available to plug into the situation in front of you. And so if you're in a fight, you see the other person's point of view. You understand possibly it's not personal. You don't need to shout. So the shortcut of anger, the emotion that comes up because your body doesn't understand the situation, is less likely to come up with as much intensity because now you do understand the situation. And similarly, meditation seems to enhance your feelings of joy and passion because it actually makes biological sense to revere one's environment in a felt way. So the first noble truth, life contains suffering. The second noble truth is this tendency towards desire and aversion. is what causes the suffering. Noble Truths 2 and 3 are really saying the same thing. They say if you get rid of the desire and aversion, the suffering goes. And Noble Truth 4 says we've got a way of getting rid of the desire and aversion. It's called the Eightfold Path. Again, this is like saying if you live in a natural way, like if you eat a natural diet, your body's less likely to get sick. If you live in a natural way, your perception of reality and your suffering will subside naturally. This way of life creates in the body the natural conditions of good mental health. And the Eightfold Path says, have the right view, which means know what reality is like as much as you can. Have the right intentions, which means seek to do good. Have the right speech. Don't speak ill of others, don't manipulate, don't lie. Tell the truth. Make your speech line up with reality. Have the right action. Do things that are good. Have the right livelihood. Engage in an occupation that does good. Make the right effort, which means strive to improve yourself. Engage in the right mindfulness, which means meditate. Engage in the right concentration, which means direct your thoughts to what's important and take it away from things that aren't. Focus on what is meaningful. Everything there is about perceiving reality as it is. Have the right speech. Don't manipulate. Means don't create a map in your head that you're trying to convey to others that is not real, because it'll take a hell of a lot of brain power to store your complex web of bloody lies, mate. And that's brain power you, of all people, cannot afford. You've got to try and plug some of that back into reality. Don't engage in scrolling through things, would be the updated version of, direct your concentration wisely. And every one of those steps is about hooking up to what is. Have the right livelihood means you won't have to create a mental construct of why you're allowed to do the detrimental thing that you're doing. If you have a job that harms people, you have to tell yourself a story about why you should be allowed to do it. Well, don't do that. It just takes up brain power. If you're doing the right kind of job, it actually connects to the community. The pattern of your behavior connects to the pattern of what things are like. And I think that is a way of making your puzzle piece fit the hole that you're supposed to be in, and making the edges of your awareness flush with reality so that you can receive the information it's sending you that was originally written into your DNA by the environment. All these things look like moral acts. It's like, this will be good for other people if I live like this. But remember, morality is synonymous with seeing what exists beyond yourself. It's not charitable. It's going to keep us alive long term. So enlightenment is the ultimate state of right seeing, nirvana, the state of connection with everything, a state of knowing what exists and the nature of reality. I hope I've explained how this right seeing came about, why the circuitry is there in the brain as far as I'm concerned, why it's been degraded by the way we've had to live, and why it's a requirement of any species that has a sustainable future, which is sad because it means that we don't, probably. I hope also you can see why Buddhist techniques combat artifice and uncloud the lens of perception really quite effectively if you do them as prescribed. Let's return to what Buddhism and Christianity says to finish. I know I mentioned it before. Buddhism says you can be enlightened. Come out of the man-made cocoon of culture, meditate for decades, and unscramble your mind. And Christianity says, for God's sake, that's another thing I don't have time. Look, I've got enough things on my to-do list that are not my job. So why should I also take on, what ideally would be the responsibility of nature? I'm not going to do it. I'm going to say no to that. I'm sorry, but I need some me time. Christianity says, look, you've got to sacrifice enlightenment in order to move forward. But remember, you're moving forward in a state of idiocy. So we might not be given to engaging in a quest for enlightenment, but please let's remember what we sacrifice when we don't, because that is our lifeline. That, understanding we are disabled when we try to perceive what's going on. And that disability is the cause of the unwitting environmental damage we do. It's the cause of unnecessary conflict. It's the cause of ill health we inflict upon ourselves. We can forgive ourselves for behaving the way we do, but we can also seek in the right way to improve our coping strategies for, the situation we're in. Thanks a lot for watching. please share your thoughts below.